We're trying to tailor some of this to southern Arizona. So what do you see as some of the specific ways a senator can help the area and the people of southern Arizona?
I mean, southern Arizona, definitely, you know, the border issue is an issue. But it's not an issue about whether or not we have a wall. It's an issue of whether or not people who are coming across undocumented are safe. And because people in the local areas have to go out and pick up the bodies of people who don't survive there. But the border issue isn't the only issue that southern Arizona has. They also have a water issue. They have the Native American issue of indigenous people wanting to cross the border back and forth because they actually have family members on the other side that are members of their tribe. The highway, I think it's Highway I-11 that they're wanting to create. I mean, where does this go? Who pays for it? What land is lost? There's a lot of things in Arizona that need to be addressed, and specifically in southern Arizona. And I believe that a U.S. Senator should be coordinating that. It's not just that the federal government makes decisions and pays for things or decides what not to pay for, but we can also be an asset within the local legislators and talking about how can the state and the federal work together so that we don't have unresolved problems and unintended consequences.
Now, you were talking about the safety of the people crossing the border. We also hear a lot of complaints and concerns from the people who are worried about their safety as border crossers cross through their land and through their neighborhoods. What do you say to folks who are concerned about their safety in that regard?
You know, I mean, there's a lot of things that we could do other than building a wall that would hurt the environment. For example, there's a lot of technology that can determine who's actually crossing, how they're crossing, how many are crossing, and really allow the Border Patrol to specifically go out when there's someone to go out for. And that technology is cheaper than building a wall and more effective. And that technology can also determine if there's tunnels as opposed to just ground crossing.
Now, if an entire family shows up, adults and children, and they have crossed in an undocumented way, what's the best way to handle them, do you think?
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends on, is it an undocumented crossing where they've actually snuck across the border, or is it, as we've been seeing lately too, where people are presenting themselves legally at the border asking for asylum? Those are way two different things to deal with. So people who cross undocumented, then we have a system to put them in detention, determine what to do with them, and you could even make the argument that it's hard to detain families together. You could actually make that argument. When you're talking about people who legally presented themselves out the border, legally asked for asylum, have not crossed the border, the government has brought them into the country and detained them and separated them at that point, that's a different problem. And then you have the old, if you're going to put all of these people in detention, then how are you putting them in detention? Do we have enough centers? Are we building more? And should we be building more? And definitely, should we house people in cages who haven't even been convicted of a crime?
What's a better way to do it?
Well, for asylum seekers, we should actually determine whether or not they have an asylum application that can be filed, allow them to file the application on its face if it is legally presented. Then what normally happens is if someone applies for asylum and their application is accepted, we give them work permit and information so that they can be in the country and support themselves while their application is going into the process.
What do you say to the argument that the Attorney General has posed that the criteria for asylum should be narrowed way, way down?
The criteria for asylum.
The idea of the situations that would qualify someone for asylum is saying, like, just fear of violence, that maybe that shouldn't apply anymore, that kind of thing.
That's actually making the argument that our asylum law doesn't already address it, which it does. You actually have to have a credible story that says that you are feeling under threat of violence, of your death, but also the U.S. government has information on the country of origin, and if they don't have any reason to believe that that country is suffering from violence, then already your asylum application is denied.
And the other side of that is if it does have a history of violence, yes, you have more of a credible argument.
Right, and then we have experts that actually interview people and know what's going on in the country and can put that against what your story is, whether your story makes sense. And if it doesn't, then it's denied already.
What's the best way to keep the economy of Southern Arizona well stimulated and strong?
We need to support more small business. That's an absolute must. If you look at Bisbee is, they're looking at not even being able to pay their fires and police departments anymore, and maybe turning them into volunteers. And how do you stimulate economy? Well, one, Bisbee is very dependent on people coming over for tourism, and then also having small businesses being supported in that why are we giving major corporations who have huge profits tax breaks when we could instead have it focused, those tax breaks focused on small businesses and help them revitalize, because small businesses are actually the ones that create the most jobs.
What's your opinion of the president's trade policies, and let's just expand that to international in general, dealings with Russia, Europe, NATO, Asian countries, China? What's your feeling about how he's been handling things?
The problem I think that we're having is we're getting a lot of mixed messages, and it feels like a lot of chaos. And what we would like to have is for the administration to explain where are they going? When they're having conversations with foreign countries, what are they doing? Are we supporting trade? Are we not supporting trade? Are we looking at both the international violations, human rights violations by countries, as well as whether or not they could be a good trade partner, and seeing whether those things whether we can put those things together, and as a leader of the world, help with the economy, help with trade, not hurt people in the United States, but at the same time look at how can we move other countries who have human rights violations toward not having those violations. I mean, NAFTA is a good example of a lot of things that have happened for other countries are not having to follow human rights and livable wages, and that is allowing a lot of U.S. companies to want to go there and have that labor, which hurts our economy because they're not having to follow the same standards we are, even though we're under a trade agreement.
Do you prefer broad trade agreements like NAFTA and, say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or country by country?
I think it has to be a combination. We can have broad that are regional, but we also have to look at what's going on in specific countries, both how those countries are operating and how that affects our country.
What do you think of the president's handling of domestic policy? And again, that's a very broad question. There's a lot to that. And just take on what topics fit in there.
So for domestic policy, I mean, I will go back again to the tax breaks, that we gave major tax breaks to corporations who were making a lot of profit, instead of focusing on small businesses that actually drive the economy and could actually increase the amount of taxes we have to spend without raising their taxes, just letting them be more prosperous. I think that we need to look at, the law enforcement. We've gotten really into protecting law enforcement no matter what they do. And while that can be a good thing, because we don't want everybody suing law enforcement, we want to stand behind law enforcement. At the same time, law enforcement needs to look at their own policies and procedures and see if that's the best way to handle within their local community, because they actually live in the local community.
Yes, how much of that is a federal issue and how much of that is something that should be left to the local?
I think it's a combination. Federal can show leadership. Just like in education, we can create programs, fund programs, and allow the local community to benefit from those programs. And then the local community wants to also fund those programs because they work. And that also is true in law enforcement. We have federal law enforcement as well, FBI, that we can demonstrate these things within the FBI, that we want to have a higher standard. We also want to protect our officers. And then we can also have programs within the local community that help with the training and the community policing.
So you reach the Senate, and the president has done something you disagree with. How would you handle that?
Just like I would handle with any colleague. One of the reasons why I got into this race is because we need colleagues standing up when colleagues say something negative about our constituents, for example, or when they do policies that don't help Americans or actually hurt Americans. We should be leaders in speaking out to what's right, and we should be able to explain why we believe that's right. We should also be open to other perspectives, but white supremacy is not a perspective that we should be open to.
Now, just in terms of the general climate out there, the political climate, and in this case I do have to mention that here you are, you're running as a Muslim, which gives you a really unique perspective. What sort of observations do you have on that?
Well, I think that my perspective is an American perspective. That's not that unique. My most unique perspective is that I was a civil rights and social justice advocate for 15 years in Arizona. The fact that I'm Muslim is just another piece of my identity, just like I'm a woman. But really it's about how can I serve Arizona, how can I serve the United States, how can I move us toward having more conversations, being more connected, solving more problems, and actually being able to address things that usually make us uncomfortable.
Have people sometimes treated you poorly because of your faith, particularly while you're out campaigning?
Not in my opinion. In my opinion, you know, people really do. If you smile and you want to have a conversation and put yourself out as an open person, people want to connect with you, and they're willing to do that. But we have to make the first step, and I like to make the first step.
Do you find that encouraging that you have been well received?
Yes, and I expected that from the beginning, because traveling all over Arizona for 15 years as a civil rights and social justice advocate, that's what I saw. You know, we've been to areas that people say, you know, how could, like, people who aren't Muslim are kind of fearful of going to those areas. And I like to think that I've gone to different areas in Arizona and shown that we are actually a family. We're the Americans, the United States, we're a family, and sometimes we're dysfunctional, and sometimes we don't know how to communicate or don't want to communicate with each other. Sometimes we don't even like each other, but that's a family. And I like to go out and show that we can connect if we put our best foot forward and try.
I think that's probably going to do it, but is there anything you just simply want to add? Sometimes there's just a topic you want to address or something you want to amplify upon, and here's your chance.
So our campaign is based on accessibility, accountability, and transparency. Everything about our campaign is transparent. We have the most detailed website because you should know where we stand and why we stand there on almost every topic imaginable. Our social media is hot, but it's also very informative and it's interesting. And all of our social media is public. You don't have to follow or like or be a friend, you know, to see it. I've signed contracts saying, you know, what I intend to, what I'll stand behind, what I want to be held accountable for. And I've made sure that I have traveled all over Arizona, meeting with every single person that I can, regardless of their political affiliation or their perspective, and been willing to answer their questions and never excluded anybody. And that's what we should expect from a U.S. Senator.
You mentioned your social media is hot. What do you mean by that?
We understand how social media works. 2016 should have been a lesson that social media is a way to reach people. And it can't be flat and boring. It has to be interesting. It has to get people's attention. And that's how we use our social media. We understand the platform and we understand the audience.
I think that's going to do it. John?
Well, like a lot of politicians don't want to touch the law enforcement. You know, it's a very divisive issue. And they're afraid to take a side, and I feel like you don't have to take a side, but you have to talk about it. They don't want to talk about the racial tensions or white supremacy. This is actually something that exists in 2018, and the fact that we haven't addressed it is why it has grown so much. It doesn't mean that you have to condemn people, but it means that you have to have the conversation to decide who we are as a country. A lot of politicians are shying away from the environment because it's become a very hot topic on, you know, whether we have protections or whether we have a free market, whether or not global warming is real. But we have to talk about these things. We can't get anywhere if we don't talk about them.
See, that was one of those last question, open question kind of things. All right, now we're